Is it working? Everybody hear me? Okay, yeah. So, yeah, Randall and I are fellow travelers at the same time when I was at the Oregon Environmental Council, beginning to question whether saving the environment was synonymous with big government. Randall was doing a lot of researching and writing on the same topic, and I was following his work. And I have to say that regional planning, especially what's known in Portland as the Metro 2040 50-year vision, I was very involved with that. That's really what pushed me over the edge. Once I got behind the scenes and got my hands dirty in the 2040 planning process, especially that the fact that Metro's own consultants were telling them it wasn't going to work and they ignored all their consultants, that meant to me it was time to move on. And so I did leave after 16 and a half years there without a job in mind. I just needed to get out of there. And fortunately, I got a job offer working for the Cascade Policy Institute, which is at the other end of the political spectrum. It's a free market think tank, and I was an environmental analyst for 6 or 7 years, and the last 7 years I've been president of Cascade. And so of this whole area, it's hard to be a specialist in everything, and so a long time ago I started taking an interest in something that became sort of a religious icon in Portland, which is transit-oriented development, or TOD. I just call them TODs for short. And Portland was the first region in the country to successfully lobby Federal Transit Administration to allow federal pork barrel money flowing to a local transit project, that some of that money could actually be siphoned off of the steel track, steel wheels project. Some of the money could be used to subsidize high-density mixed-use development right next to the rail station to integrate, from their standpoint, fully integrate land use planning and transportation, so that they had this vision of these high-density projects popping up along rail stations. And so by taking some FTA money away from the actual track and using it to subsidize TODs, that was a big breakthrough, and Portland was an innovator. And I knew people back in the early 90s who were actually involved, either at the governor's office level or metro level or whatever, in certain sites, and I started taking pictures of these because I knew it would be important to photograph them over time. And I started taking pictures and then learning more about the behind-the-scenes subsidies, and then eventually I went out and started monitoring them, treating them sort of like an anthropological project. You know, there'd be this new sort of breed of people, new culture of TOD dwellers, and I wanted to know, regardless of what they said about their travel patterns, I wanted to know how they actually traveled if you just watched them, because I was very suspicious of surveys. I always felt that people know what the politically correct answer is to a survey. So I started watching them, and I discovered that if you watch them, their travel patterns tend to be a lot different than what they say their patterns are. And so that's been the focus of my work for the last 10 years, is to spend a lot of time going to, especially the showcase TODs that Portland gets a lot of international attention for, and trying to distinguish between the Wizard of Oz version, which is, you know, sound and fury up on the screen, and there's a little guy over here in a booth, he's just pulling levers, you know, and I try and distinguish those. So let's see if this advances. Okay, all right. So it's really important for people to understand. Okay, that one's better than that one. Okay, that this document was produced in 1997 by 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which is probably the nation's most prominent private nonprofit advocate of intensive top-down land use planning. And they had a project called LUTRAQ, L-U-T-R-A-Q, which stands for Land Use, Transportation, Air Quality Connection. And this, just as light rail, the light rail mania in Portland emerged because they were opposed to a freeway project some 40 years ago. And if you're opposed to something, it helps you politically if you say what you're actually in favor of. And light rail emerged basically as, well, it's not a freeway, it's light rail, it sounds good, and has sort of morphed into this huge cult following since. Well, 1,000 Friends folks were opposed to freeway expansions on the west side of Portland, including what was supposed to be basically the mirror image of 205, I-205, a 205 version on the west side, known colloquially as the Western Bypass. And they raised a bunch of money, about $1 million from private and public sources, and hired Peter Calthorpe, one of the most prominent so-called new urbanist architect/designer types out of the Bay Area. They hired Peter Calthorpe and a bunch of other contractors. And their hypothesis was, if we canceled the highway, Western Bypass, if we canceled other highway improvements to Highway 26, and if we were to impose top-down planning and new urbanist principles on essentially most of Washington County, could we convert people's travel patterns through land use planning and design? Could we reduce their dependency on automobiles? Oh, and assuming that we have light rail, could we increase the mode split sufficiently that you wouldn't need the highway? So that was put forward sort of as a hypothesis, but in a science experiment, the actual evidence would prove or disprove the hypothesis. Well, this wasn't science, this was politically rigged, of course. So the consultants issued their reports, and they concluded, well, of course, if we do all these things, we don't need the highway. So I want to point particularly on the west side of Portland, where the West Side Max expanded, they deliberately ran the unlike probably anywhere else in the country, they ran the train through a bunch of cow pastures and woodlots. And it was going to be a blank slate. This was going to be the build it and they will come. This was considered actually so ludicrous by FTA that they weren't going to fund this until Mark Hatfield, then senior senator from Oregon, had a little meeting with the top FTA officials and essentially crammed the money down their throats. But as part of that, his concession was that TriMet and Metro, if they got the money to build this western extension, would use the powers of zoning to force every jurisdiction along the west side line to build these types of TODs. And what I want to point out here is that the Lou-Track project, which emerged in the early 90s, became the template, and to this day, it remains sort of the Bible. A lot of you have probably never heard of Lou-Track, but for those of us back in the day, I was actually asked by 1,000 Friends to be on some little bogus advisory committee for them at the time, because I used to pal around with a lot of people at 1,000 Friends, which gave me an insider's view. I was reading their grant proposals they were submitting and all the assertions they made about this. That was good for me. It was a window into the back room there of what they were doing. So this was going to be the brave new world, you see, that this template would show that if we take away road building, if we put lots of money into light rail, if we use the power of zoning to force people to live in a way they don't really want to, that they won't drive very much. And so the Lou-Track project served its purpose. Governor Goldschmidt and then Governor Roberts killed off the Western Bypass, killed off most road expansion in Portland, and then Lou-Track sort of faded away. But this Bible continues to drive policy in the Portland region to the point where you have Mayor Sam Adams saying, look, if there isn't light rail in Vancouver, then there will be no other improvements. Light rail drives everything. The CRC project is, in my mind, a light rail project. Oh, and by the way, there's a highway and some interchange improvements thrown in for political cover, but it's fundamentally a light rail project. And most light rail advocates don't actually defend light rail anymore as a people mover. Because if you do the math, you realize that light rail is a very low capacity, very slow system that even in theory can't move very many people. And so now it's justified as, oh, but it's a catalyst for transit-oriented development, or TOD. And these drawings are always very seductive. You look up there, and here's the light rail line. Whoops. There it is. Light rail line. This was all blank land at the time. And you have these multicolored concentric rings, the most density here, a little less density here, a little less density here. I don't know what the purple stands for, but this was all blank land at the time. And you look at it, and actually it's not that offensive. It has nice colors. It's kind of a calming effect. And I've seen hundreds of these architectural renderings of projects over time, and they're always meant to calm you down. This isn't going to be bad. This is, You know, put a little anesthesia there, and then we can drill in your teeth, and you won't feel a thing. It's just fine. Relax. So this was done in, okay, the report was published in 97. By this point, the governors had killed off the Western Bypass. West Side Light Rail opened a year late in September of 1998. Then Vice President Al Gore came out to break the champagne bottle on the first train and have it leave Hillsborough. And this report that this came from predicted that if you actually did what their utopian planners said to do and create a bunch of these, that at Elmonica Station specifically, by 2010, they could get up to 28% of all AM peak trips on the train. So in 2009, I said, well, gee, 2010 is almost here. Why don't we find out what actually happened? There's a prediction. Planners are great at making predictions. What they really hate is when you go back later and compare reality to the prediction. They're hoping you would just forget about all that. So we went out in the field and did that. So today, here is that's the light rail station, and that's Hillsborough, that's Portland. Here is a big park and ride from TriMet. Here's Elmonica Station condos, very dense units. Autumn Meadows, this is an incredibly dense series of row houses and tiny, narrow little streets. It's really grotesque. And then over here is more typical suburbia. Arbor Station it's a pretty dense product, tiny. It's okay if you don't have any kids. All these things are sort of child-free zones, and they hope car-free zones too, but they're not. There's cars stacked everywhere. This continues to remain open space, and then you have another really gross project called Steel Park up here, which I wrote a whole case study on 8 or 9 years ago. This was considered the first suburban TOD success story by TriMet, although over the last 8 or 9 years, since my case study, they've downplayed it. They almost never mention Steel Park anymore. It's kind of a light rail ghetto. So that's the bird's eye view, and these are the types of housing products that what we're talking about here. This is these are the condos. This is the TriMet park and ride, and then light rail is down here. And when I monitor there, by the way, it was kind of comical. We'd monitor all the ins and outs in the morning, and we have categories. Did they get in the car and drive away? Did they walk? Did they bike? Did they walk to the max? And one morning I was there, and a yuppie couple in their late 20s, very professional. They come out of their first floor condo, and they get in a $40,000 SUV, and they start to drive away. But now the woman drives down from here to the light rail, which is about 100 yards away, and drops her husband off at the train, and then she drives away. I thought, I don't have a category in my spreadsheet for that. The whole point here, the whole utopian dream is that you use the power of zoning and the power of government subsidies. There's a whole buffet of 8 or 9 different revenue streams, subsidy streams that they put into these things through below-cost land deals and tax credits and grants and SDC waivers and a bunch of things where all these things are propped up with subsidies. But the whole thing is, if you live in one of these things, you're supposed to get up, go out the door, and walk to the train. If your spouse drives you 100 yards and gives you a kiss and drops you off, that's not even a category. What am I supposed to call that, a transit trip? Sure, it's a transit trip, but you drove there 100 yards? I mean, anyway, that's what happens. This is another product. So all these things, they presume there's a shortage of land, which of course is absurd. Oregon is basically nothing but land, nothing but wide open space. And they want to cram people in, no yards. Okay, so we monitored this pretty heavily. But you see these 4 different products, different developments. I actually monitored about 7 or 8, but I didn't want to clutter up the slide. We monitored basically every single thing near within walking distance. And what you see is Elmonica Station condo is the closest, had a decent morning max split of up around 10%, but all these other ones, it doesn't matter how close they are to the train. It doesn't matter that it's easy to get there. It doesn't matter that you've made skinny streets, tiny yards, no yards, made it difficult to drive. in the morning when they get up, a lot of these people, actually, if you ask them, they might say they think the train is an amenity, and that's one reason they live there. But if you say, are you going to take the train today? Clearly they would say, well, no. They assume someone else is taking the train, their neighbor or somebody. Or that, yeah, I took it to a Blazer game last year. Oh, okay, yeah. So out in Beaverton Round, let's see, I think I have till 10:15, okay? Beaverton Round is kind of famous. This is an aerial view. This is a former sewage treatment facility by Beaverton, and the goal here was to convert it and give Beaverton the downtown that it never had. According to the Beaverton City Council and the planners, the Peter Calthorpe types, Beaverton residents suffered from some kind of identity crisis, that it was too spread out, it was auto-oriented, it had backyards and trees, and that was alienating to them. So they needed some kind of dense center to pray to or something downtown, I don't know. And this is the way it is today. But again, what I like to call attention to is the way they anesthetize you with these architectural renderings. And you will see this for sure if you go to any of the goofy hearings in Vancouver about light rail stations on Hayden Island or in Vancouver and what it's going to be like. And they're going to roll out these things. Now, it's very humorous that, and this is why I started taking these photographs. This was taken in 1996 or 7. You have to take these things when they're happening because they're so precious, because later you can't go back and get them. I mean, these are moments of history. So here you have on this fence, it says, coming soon, right here, the round. Now, I don't know if you can see, because there's a big spotlight up there that is kind of in my eyes, but here's the kind of clamshell set of condos, and here's going to be the light rail, and here's some amorphous buildings, and an open space, and some trees, and some people, and of course it's not raining. It's never raining in these slides. It's always sunny, because that's so like Portland. And okay, now, what is the one thing you don't see in this big 5x7 architectural rendering? Cars. See, this is the post-car world. This is Lutrac. This is where we get 28%. Excuse me, gee, it wasn't 28%, it was about 3% in reality. But okay, this is where we're going to get 28%, and we don't need those stinking cars because we have light rail, and it's coming soon right here. Okay, oops, the sign is still there, and the first developer is bankrupt now in 1997. Gee. Turns out when you build on a former sewage treatment plant, there's soil problems, had to truck in some more soil, jack up the cost. Oh, gee, then had a lot of other problems and needed more subsidies. Okay, so that didn't quite work out. Oh, 1999, still bankrupt. Oh, 2000, still bankrupt. So then on this day, actually, they sucked the California developer into taking over this whole thing. I guess they couldn't find anybody in Oregon. They got a California developer, came up and took it over. And on this very day, I commuted by train that morning from the west side, and I see a bunch of guys from the Tualatin Fire and Rescue up on the roof looking around. And I said to myself, I know what's happening. The project, after years of dormancy, is starting up again. I need to take some pictures. This is going to have right here. So I get to work downtown. I call my wife. I said, you have a better camera. I said, you got to meet me out the round right now. We got to go out there. Go out there. We took pictures. And about 10 minutes after I took the picture, the last of those tarps was dropped down to the ground, and they started developing it. But turns out when I took this picture in 2010, you might see all of this black mesh across the way. Yeah, the people living there had sued for water damage, and they had to go back and rehab. And as the California developer said before he went bankrupt a couple years ago, gee, you know, when you buy a project like this and it says as is, it means as is. And if there's water damage that you ended up buying that you didn't know about, gee, that's on you. And maybe that's why he's bankrupt now. And so that's the, you know, that this is not actually a sunny day. It occasionally rains in Portland, and there's not a ton of people out there, and there's some retail somewhere down in there, and some people living here. And oh, well, what happened? There's cars here. Here's the round. Here's the train station. That wasn't in the original plan. Oh, there's cars in the back. In fact, it's gated. Private parking for the people in the clamshell condos. Oh, there's the biggest parking structure, the biggest structure, single structure in the entire city of Beaverton. Nothing but parking. Retailers not doing too well. And next door here was the Westgate Theater, approximately right here. And Metro, our regional government, twice appropriated $2 million, $4 million total, to help tear down the Westgate Theater so that we could expand the success story of the Beaverton Round, because it was working so well. They did this after it had already gone bankrupt. Okay, there's zero learning going on here. See, when you spend someone else's money and you have no skin in the game yourself, it's really easy to blow off $4 million to bulldoze a theater and have a parking lot. And it turns out, when they wanted someone to step up to the plate and create Beaverton Round Part 2, you know, the son of the round, no one was dumb enough to step up and do that. So it continues to be an empty place. So my time is winding down. I just want to get to the end here. The Achilles heel of the Lutrac vision of the TriMet Metro Pro Train vision is that when they say seductively, well, we can't sprawl, I mean, whatever sprawl is, that's some kind of pejorative all-purpose term that doesn't mean anything, but we can't have low-density development at the fringe. We have to build up and not out, because building up is so much cheaper. Yeah, except that it's so much more expensive. See, in the whole Orwellian vocabulary of these discussions, you have to understand when they say cheaper, they mean more expensive. When they say faster, they mean slower. When they say it's good for you, they mean it's bad for you. You have to cut through all this, because this is a study done for Portland based on 74 projects. It was published in '97, and the exact numbers would be different now, but the relationship among the numbers would be the same, which is that when you build up, and there's another slide I didn't include here, which is just by density, not by height. The more you densify, the more you build up, there is a straight line correlation between that and cost. Building up is not cheaper. It turns out all your foundation work is more expensive. If you have any government money involved, in the Portland area at least, you're going to be sucked into big, expensive green mandates, lead mandates. And once you get steel workers involved and crane operators, you're talking about the most expensive unionized labor out there, short of dock workers maybe. The financing is going to be expensive. You put structured parking in there. Well, structured parking could be $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a stall versus a few thousand maybe for surface parking. Every input to the development process, soft costs, hard costs, go dramatically up when you build up. So it turns out all these utopian Todds that Peter Calthorpe was drawing about with his little drawings, if you can even induce someone to build them, they only are feasible when you have a whole stream of subsidies that you put in front of developers they can chow down at. And they're happy to do that. They're very pragmatic people. If you shove money in their pockets, they'll take it. But then you just promote crony capitalism where it's a rigged market. It doesn't really reflect people's preferences. And at the end of the day, as we already know from monitoring, even when you put people in high-density buildings right near light rail, when they get up in the morning, most of the time they take the car. This is just another quick slide that shows you a different way where this plays out. This is a Beaverton Creek Light Rail Station on the west side, and the train obviously is there heading towards Portland. Nike World Campus is way over there across this wooded lot. Beaverton Creek Business Park is here, and there's a 6-acre open space that's been there for the entire 12 years that West Side Light Rail has opened. Now, why is that open space? So I contacted the owner of it, Spec Development, and I said, well, you have this prime 6-acre area of land right next to light rail. And the utopian vision is that developers will be stampeding to get here because light rail induces this development. Why aren't you there? And they said, they're very practical people. They said, look, we think rail is an amenity. We have nothing against it. But the parking The parking overlay would force us to put parking at about 25% below the market rate out here in Washington County. The density requirement is too high. Lenders are not going to go for a project like that. End of discussion. No ranting, no raving, happy to help, happy to build projects next to light rail. Lenders aren't going to go for a project like that. Developers are not suicidal. They like to stay in business. They like to have customers who are happy. So when the planners and the politicians try and force density and parking restrictions in areas where the market rejects it, all you get is land sitting there underutilized. If that's what the pro-transit people are happy with, fine. But if you own the land, it's been devalued to approximately zero value. You can't do anything with it. The people who live in the apartment complexes nearby, they think this is great. They walk their dogs there. They play soccer. They play Frisbee. Fine, it's open space. But you're not getting any development there. And finally, I think this is my final slide, yeah. Aside from residential, we went out and did counts, AM peak counts, at about 20 large work sites near light rail on the west side. Some like Hawthorne Farm Intel out in Hillsborough, where the train, if the train came any closer to the Intel facility, it would be inside the Intel lobby. It's so close. But we went out there one morning. It's really easy to monitor how people come and go because Intel is a secure facility. You don't just kind of casually wander in and out. There's very limited ways to enter. And only about 3% of the workers arrived by train. 97% arrived in SOV. And we did the Nike World Headquarters, which has a shuttle that Nike provides going to and from the Beaverton Creek Light Rail Station. About 96% of people at Nike arrive by private automobile. And we looked at a lot of others, Reese's Fine Foods, other places you wouldn't have heard of, but they're employers right next to light rail. And it turns out that the mode split is up close to 90% for auto, 7,170 trips on a morning, average morning. So this is not a tiny little share. This is a lot of trips we're talking about here. And max is basically nothing. So I have a few more things that I was thinking of talking about, but my time is up and I've got other speakers. So I think I'll just stop, and I'll conclude by saying I'm not inherently opposed to trains. Actually, I used to commute from New Jersey into New York City on the commuter train, and I enjoyed it. I kind of like trains, but light rail is just a failed paradigm. The transit-oriented development is failed. It's not scalable. Even if you can find one that works occasionally, you can't scale it up into a mass market. And so any conversation that's had in Vancouver about light rail needs to be a conversation about its people-moving abilities, not whether it is a catalyst for development. And I had Mrs. Turley there has a handout, which I think maybe you can just pass it out. It's one thing I was going to talk about where I compared. I think I have about 50 copies. Yeah, go ahead. I didn't put it in my PowerPoint. She has copies of something where on the east side, the Max line, this summer, I looked at a high-density project called Russellville, an 11-acre project that has 52 units per acre along the east side Max line. And then it took 15 years to build out. It's subsidized. It's all regulated. And then across the tracks is a neighborhood that escaped the planner's mandates after 25 years. It's all basically 6 units per acre, 8,000 square foot lots, and all the traffic in and out is controlled by a few entry points. So we monitored it. And what we found, and it's in these charts here, is that yes, the Russellville project, this totally utopian, high-density, subsidized HOD, gets about 13% light rail market share in the morning, and the old Gleason neighborhood left alone gets about 7%. So yes, you could say, well, wow, the Todd model is working. It's almost 100% higher market share. But the density of the Russellville is 10 times the density of Old Gleason. So if you have to increase the density by 10 to get not quite 100% increase transit market share, I'm not sure that's really replicable on a broad basis. And furthermore, 13% morning peak at 102nd Street in Burnside in Portland, it's not that high. And it's not that difficult for any non-auto mode to get 8 or 9% market share. 13%, it's okay. Try to get above 15%, it's really, really hard. If you're not in the dense downtown area. So that's just something that'll be in a future slideshow, but I have some handouts now, and I think I'll just stop there. So, thanks.